The laughter stopped mid-sentence. Jimmy Fallon froze behind his desk, his signature smile fading as he processed what Tones and I had just whispered into her microphone. The Tonight Show studio, usually buzzing with energy and anticipation, fell into a silence so profound you could hear the hum of the stage lights overhead. It had started as any other Tuesday night taping. The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon was in full swing, with Tones and I scheduled as the musical guest to promote her latest album. She sat across from Jimmy in the guest chair, her quirky style and infectious energy lighting up the stage as they chatted about her meteoric rise to fame. Jimmy had been in his element, cracking jokes about her unique stage name, and doing his trademark impressions of her hit songs. The audience was eating it up, laughing at his playful attempts to recreate her distinctive vocal style. But then, in a moment of genuine curiosity, Jimmy asked a question that would change everything. "You know, your voice is so unique, so distinctively you," Jimmy had said, leaning forward with that warm, encouraging smile that made guests feel like they were talking to an old friend. "Was it always like that? Did you always know you had this incredible gift?" That's when Tones and I's expression shifted. The playful energy that had carried their conversation suddenly evaporated, replaced by something heavier, more vulnerable. She looked down at her hands, then back up at Jimmy with eyes that seemed to be deciding whether to share something sacred. "Actually, Jimmy," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I almost had surgery to make it sound normal." The words hung in the air like smoke. Jimmy's eyebrows furrowed, not in confusion, but in the kind of deep concern that comes when someone reveals a pain you didn't know existed. Behind the cameras, producers exchanged glances, sensing that this conversation had just taken an unexpected turn into something profound. "What do you mean?" Jimmy asked gently, setting down the index cards he'd been holding. This wasn't about the scheduled talking points anymore. This was about a human being sharing something real. Tones and I took a shaky breath, looking out at the audience that had gone completely silent. "When I was 18, I saved up $3,000 to get vocal cord surgery," she continued, her Australian accent thick with emotion. "I was convinced that my voice was the reason no one would sign me, the reason I kept getting rejected. I thought if I could just sound like everyone else, like what the industry wanted, maybe I'd have a chance." Jimmy leaned back slightly, processing this revelation. Here was one of the most distinctive voices in modern music, a voice that had brought joy to millions around the world, and she had once wanted to change it completely. "Tell me about that," Jimmy said, his voice stripped of all performance, all entertainment value. This was just Jimmy, the person, talking to someone who clearly needed to be heard. Tones and I's eyes filled with tears, but she continued. "I had grown up listening to the radio, watching award shows, seeing what success looked like in the music industry. Every female artist seemed to have this perfect, polished sound, and here I was with this weird, quirky voice that didn't fit anywhere. I convinced myself that my voice was a flaw, something that needed fixing. The camera operators, who had filmed thousands of hours of late-night television, found themselves leaning in closer. This wasn't typical talk show fare. This was raw, honest, and completely unscripted. I remember sitting in the consultation room," she went on, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "The doctor was explaining how they could modify my vocal cords, how they could make me sound more mainstream. I had the money in my bank account. I had the appointment scheduled. I was ready to give up the one thing that made me—" Jimmy shook his head slowly, and for a moment, his professional composure cracked. "What stopped you?" he asked, though something in his tone suggested he suspected this story was about to take a turn that would break everyone's heart. Tones and I wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. "My little brother," she said simply. "The night before my appointment, he heard me crying in my room. When he asked what was wrong, I told him about the surgery. And you know what that 8-year-old kid said to me?" She paused, looking directly at Jimmy, then at the camera, then back to Jimmy. He said, "But Tony, if you change your voice, who's going to sing my bedtime songs the way I love them?" The silence in the studio was deafening. Jimmy's eyes had visibly welled up, and he wasn't trying to hide it. Several audience members had their hands over their hearts, and others were openly crying. That's when I realized, Tones and I continued, her voice now clear and strong, that I wasn't just changing my voice. I was erasing myself. I was about to surgically remove the thing that made me who I am, because I thought fitting in was more important than being authentic. Jimmy stood up from behind his desk, something he rarely did during interviews. He walked around and sat on the edge of his desk, closer to his guest, his body language shifting from host to friend, from entertainer to empathetic listener. "Did you cancel the appointment?" Jimmy asked softly. "I called the doctor's office at 6 in the morning," she nodded. "Lost my deposit, but I kept my voice. And 6 months later, I was busking on the streets with that same weird voice, playing the songs that would eventually become Dance Monkey." Jimmy shook his head in amazement. "So the voice that the whole world fell in love with, the voice that made you a global sensation, you almost—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "Almost got rid of it completely," she confirmed. "Because I thought being different was being wrong." That's when Jimmy did something unprecedented. He looked directly at his production team and made a gesture that surprised everyone. "Do we still have that recording equipment in the back?" he asked. "The vintage stuff we used for that throwback segment last month?" The producers, confused but trusting Jimmy's instincts, nodded. "Tones," Jimmy said, turning back to her. "Would you be willing to do something with me? Something that might help people understand what almost happened?" She nodded, curious but trusting. Within minutes, the Tonight Show crew had wheeled out an old-fashioned recording setup, complete with vintage microphones and analog equipment. Jimmy explained to the audience that they were going to do something they'd never done before on the show. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jimmy announced, his voice carrying a weight that transcended entertainment, "we're going to hear something extraordinary. Tones is going to perform Dance Monkey, the way she thought she was supposed to sound before she learned to love her authentic voice." The audience was completely captivated as Tones and I approached the vintage microphone. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and began to sing her biggest hit in a completely different voice. Gone was the distinctive, quirky tone that had made her famous. Instead, she sang in a generic, technically perfect but soulless voice that could have belonged to any number of mainstream pop stars. The effect was jarring. The song, stripped of its unique character, sounded hollow, forgettable, like a cover version of itself. Even though the melody was the same, the words were the same, something essential was missing. The magic was gone. When she finished, the studio was silent for a long moment. Then Jimmy spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "Now," he said simply, "sing it as yourself." What happened next gave everyone in that studio chills. Tones and I opened her mouth and let her authentic voice fill the space. The quirky, distinctive, absolutely unique sound that had made Dance Monkey a global phenomenon. The song came alive in ways that the previous version couldn't touch. It was the difference between a photocopy and an original painting. The audience erupted in applause, but it wasn't the typical late-night show cheering. It was the kind of applause that comes from deep recognition, from understanding that they had just witnessed something profound about authenticity, about the courage it takes to be yourself in a world that constantly tells you to be someone else. Jimmy wiped his eyes openly now, not caring that millions of people were watching. "That," he said, pointing to the vintage recording equipment, "that first version is what the world would have gotten if you had changed your voice. And this," he gestured to her, to the magic that had just filled the studio, "this is what we almost lost forever." Tones and I was crying openly now, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of gratitude, of relief, of recognition that her 8-year-old brother had saved not just her voice, but her entire identity. "Can I tell you something?" Jimmy said, stepping closer to the microphone. "My daughter is 7 years old, and when she sings along to your songs in the car, she tries to make her voice sound just like yours. Not like what the industry thinks she should sound like you, because you taught her that different is beautiful. The camera caught the exact moment when Tones and I's composure completely broke. She covered her face with her hands, overwhelmed by the realization that by keeping her authentic voice, she hadn't just saved her own career, she had given permission to countless others to embrace their own uniqueness. Jimmy, sensing that this moment needed to be honored rather than rushed past, did something else that broke television protocol. He gestured for the audience to stand, and without prompting, they rose in unison, not for applause, but in recognition, a standing acknowledgement of the courage it takes to be yourself. Ladies and gentlemen, Jimmy said, his voice carrying across the silent studio. This is what happens when someone chooses to be themselves instead of what they think the world wants them to be. This is what happens when an 8-year-old brother saves the world from losing something beautiful. This is what happens when we realize that our differences aren't flaws to be fixed, they're gifts to be shared. The episode, when it aired, became one of the most watched Tonight Show segments in the show's history. Not because of celebrity drama or viral comedy, but because millions of people recognized themselves in Tones and I's story. The struggle to fit in, the pressure to change, the courage it takes to stay true to yourself. But perhaps the most powerful part of the story came later, when Jimmy revealed that his daughter had written a letter to Tones and I after watching the show. In her 7-year-old handwriting, she had written, "Thank you for keeping your voice the way it is. It made me want to keep mine too." Because sometimes the most important performances happen when you stop performing and start being real. And sometimes the greatest gift you can give the world is simply the courage to sound like yourself. In the weeks following the episode, something extraordinary happened that no one could have predicted. The Tonight Show's social media team started receiving thousands of videos from young artists around the world, each one sharing their own stories about embracing their authentic voices. A teenage girl from Brazil posted a video of herself singing in Portuguese, explaining how Tones and I's story gave her the courage to audition for her school's talent show in her native language, instead of trying to sing like American pop stars. A young man from Ireland shared how he'd been told his accent was too strong for radio, but after watching the episode, decided to start his own podcast celebrating regional dialects. The hashtag #YourVoice began trending globally, becoming a movement far beyond music. Artists, writers, dancers, and creators of all kinds shared their stories of almost changing fundamental parts of themselves to fit industry expectations. The message was clear: authenticity wasn't just about vocal cords, it was about having the courage to show up as yourself in a world that profits from conformity. Jimmy, deeply moved by the response, decided to create a special segment on his show called Authentic Voices, where he would regularly feature artists who had chosen to embrace their uniqueness rather than conform to industry standards. The first guest was a 9-year-old rapper from Chicago who wrote songs about his grandmother's wisdom. The second was an elderly woman from Scotland who had started a YouTube channel at age 85, sharing traditional folk songs she'd learned as a child. But perhaps the most touching follow-up came 3 months later when Tones and I returned to the show. This time, she brought with her the 8-year-old brother who had unknowingly saved her voice and, by extension, changed the trajectory of pop music forever. Jimmy knelt down to the boy's level, just as he had done in countless other emotional moments on his show, and asked him if he understood what his words had meant to his sister. The boy, shy but articulate, looked directly into the camera and said, "I just wanted her to keep singing my bedtime songs. I didn't know it would make other kids happy too." That simple statement, delivered with the honesty only children possess, became the most shared clip from any Tonight Show episode that year. It was a reminder that sometimes the most profound changes in the world come from the smallest acts of love, from someone simply asking us to stay who we are. Tones and I later revealed that she still calls her brother before every major performance, not for luck, but to remember why she chose to keep her voice. "He reminds me that I'm not just performing for millions of people," she explained. I'm singing for that little boy who fell asleep to my lullabies and loved them exactly as they were. The vintage recording equipment Jimmy had brought out that night became a permanent fixture in the Tonight Show studio, used whenever a guest wanted to demonstrate the difference between performing for acceptance and performing from authenticity. It became known among staff as the Truth microphone, because somehow, standing behind that old-fashioned setup, guests found the courage to share parts of themselves they'd never revealed before. Years later, when music historians looked back at the late 2010s and early 2020s, they would point to that Tuesday night episode as a turning point. Not just in Tones and I's career, but in the industry's slow shift towards celebrating uniqueness over uniformity. Record labels began signing artists specifically for their distinctive sounds, rather than trying to mold them into existing categories. The episode also changed Jimmy himself. In interviews afterwards, he spoke about how witnessing someone's near miss with losing their authentic self made him more conscious of moments when he was performing rather than connecting. Tones taught me that the best interviews happen when you stop trying to be funny and start trying to be human, he reflected. When you create space for people to be vulnerable, magic happens. The letter from Jimmy's 7-year-old daughter became the inspiration for a children's book about celebrating differences, with proceeds going to music education programs in underserved communities. The book's simple message, written in a child's perspective, was, "The world has enough copies, it needs more originals." That night in the Tonight Show studio, when laughter stopped and truth began, millions of viewers witnessed something that transcended entertainment. They saw what happens when someone chooses authenticity over acceptance, when a child's love saves a sibling's identity, and when a talk show host creates space for the kind of conversations that change lives. The voice that almost wasn't became the voice that inspired a generation to keep their own. And sometimes that's how the world changes, one authentic note at a time.